Welcome back to Neighborhood
You
Karma,
can't just put up a
where
sign like
entitled
that. This
people
is a
get
violation
exactly
of
what
Rule
they
3B.
deserve and property disputes turn into
my
epic
land,
justice
ma'am.
stories. Today's tale involves a power-hungry Karen, a mysterious inheritance, and one of the most satisfying property ownership reveals you'll ever hear. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I'm about to tell you how a vindictive HOA president tried to ruin my life, not knowing that I literally owned the ground she was standing on. It all started 18 months ago when I inherited my great-aunt Rosa's house in Sunset Valley, an upscale planned community outside Phoenix, Arizona. Aunt Rosa had been like a grandmother to me. She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, putting me through college and supporting my dreams of becoming a landscape architect. When Aunt Rosa passed away at 89, she left me everything: her beautiful Spanish-style home, her savings, and what the lawyer described as various real estate investments that I'd need to review after settling the estate. I was grieving and overwhelmed, so I focused on the house and planned to deal with the investment properties later. The house was gorgeous, a 3,200 square foot adobe-style home built in 1995, with a red tile roof, arched doorways, and a stunning desert garden that Aunt Rosa had spent decades perfecting. It sat on a corner lot in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in Sunset Valley, surrounded by similar homes worth $600,000 to $800,000. Sunset Valley was a master-planned community of about 400 homes, built in phases between 1992 and 2005. The HOA managed common areas, enforced architectural standards, and maintained the community's reputation as one of the most prestigious addresses in the area. Monthly fees were $200, which seemed reasonable for the level of maintenance and amenities provided. For the first few months after moving in, everything was perfect. The neighbors were friendly, the community was well maintained, and I loved working in Aunt Rosa's garden while getting settled into my new life. I kept my landscape architecture business running remotely, taking on projects throughout the Southwest while enjoying the peaceful desert lifestyle. The trouble began when Karen Hoffman was elected HOA president in November 2023. Karen was everything you'd expect from a stereotypical HOA tyrant: mid-50s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, driving a white BMW X5 with personalized plates reading HOPRES. She'd moved to Sunset Valley 2 years earlier after divorcing her hedge fund manager husband, determined to reinvent herself as a community leader with unlimited time to micromanage everyone else's lives. Karen's campaign for HOA president had been built on promises to restore proper standards and eliminate the declining property values caused by negligent homeowners. She claimed that the previous board had been too lenient and that she would bring professional property management expertise to the community. What she actually brought was a reign of terror disguised as community improvement. Karen's first act as president was to hire her boyfriend's property management company to handle HOA operations, despite their bid being $50,000 higher than competitors. Her second act was to launch what she called a comprehensive compliance audit of every property in Sunset Valley. I received my first violation notice in December, just 3 weeks after Karen took office. Ms. Martinez, the letter began, our recent inspection has identified multiple violations of Sunset Valley covenants, conditions, and restrictions that require immediate correction. The violations were absurd. My desert landscaping included non-approved plant species, native cacti that had been there for decades. My outdoor furniture was inconsistent with community aesthetic standards, and my mailbox needed repainting because the current color was faded beyond acceptable parameters. I called the HOA management company to discuss these citations. I'm sorry, Ms. Martinez, said the property manager, Steve Walsh. Mrs. Hoffman has been very strict about enforcement since taking over. She says the previous board let too many things slide. But these plants have been here for 20 years. My aunt never received any complaints about them. Mrs. Hoffman says she's enforcing the CC and RS as written, not as they were previously interpreted. I decided to attend the next board meeting to address these issues directly. What I witnessed was shocking. Karen ran the meeting like a dictator, cutting off homeowners who tried to dispute violations and dismissing appeals without genuine consideration. When my turn came to speak, Karen barely looked up from her notes. Ms. Martinez, your property has multiple ongoing violations. You have 14 days to achieve compliance or face escalating fines. Mrs. Hoffman, these plants are native species that have been part of the landscaping for decades. They're drought-resistant and environmentally appropriate for our climate. What was allowed in the past is irrelevant. The CC and RS clearly state that all landscaping must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Can you show me where native desert plants are specifically prohibited? Karen's expression turned cold. Are you questioning my interpretation of our governing documents? I have extensive experience in property management and community standards. I'm just asking to understand the specific language that supports these violations. This is not a debate forum, Ms. Martinez. You have your notice. Comply or face consequences. Over the following months, Karen's harassment campaign escalated dramatically. Every week brought new violation notices for increasingly ridiculous infractions. My garden hose was visible from the street. My car was parked improperly in my own driveway. My outdoor light fixtures were the wrong style. Each violation carried mounting fines: $100 for the first offense, $200 for the second, $500 for the third. By spring, I was facing over $4,000 in accumulated penalties for violations that seemed designed purely to harass me. The situation reached a breaking point in April when I received a violation notice that left me speechless. According to Karen, my entire front yard landscaping was an unauthorized modification that violated community standards and needed to be completely removed and replanted with approved species within 30 days. She was demanding that I destroy Aunt Rosa's beloved desert garden. 20 years of carefully cultivated native plants, including rare cacti and desert wildflowers that had taken decades to establish. The cost of replacement would be at least $15,000, not including the environmental damage of destroying a mature desert ecosystem. That evening, I called my probate attorney, Maria Santos, who had handled Aunt Rosa's estate. "Jessica," she said after I explained the situation, "I think it's time we discussed those real estate investments your aunt left you. There are some things about your inheritance that you need to understand." Maria came to my house the next morning with several boxes of documents and a thick folder that she'd been keeping in her office safe. "When your Aunt Rosa bought this house in 1995, Maria began, she wasn't just buying a home. She was making a strategic real estate investment based on inside information about the community's development plans." She spread out a surveyor's map on my dining table, showing Sunset Valley as it existed in the early 1990s. "Your aunt had a friend, Elena Vasquez, who worked for Desert Sun Development Corporation, the company that was planning Sunset Valley. Elena told Rosa that the development would be built in phases, and that certain parcels of land would become extremely valuable as the community grew." Maria pointed to various areas on the map. "Rosa bought this house, but she also bought several other parcels throughout the area before development began. She was essentially betting that Sunset Valley would be successful and that these lots would appreciate dramatically in value." "What kind of parcels?" "That's where it gets interesting. Rosa bought what the developers called community infrastructure parcels, land designated for common areas, retention basins, the community center, and even some of the lots where individual houses would later be built." Maria pulled out a series of property deeds that made my head spin. Over the course of several years, Rosa acquired ownership of 17 different parcels throughout Sunset Valley. Some are small utility easements, others are substantial lots with houses on them. "Wait, are you saying Aunt Rosa owned other people's land?" "Not exactly. She owned the parcels, but when the development was completed, most were sold to individual homeowners or transferred to the HOA for common area management. However, Rosa retained ownership of several key parcels under long-term lease agreements." Maria showed me a document that changed everything. "Your aunt owns, well, now you own, the land underneath 12 homes in Sunset Valley, including the community center, 2 of the neighborhood parks, and the retention basin that prevents flooding." I stared at the documents, trying to process what she was telling me. But how is that possible? How can I own land that other people built houses on? "Ground leases," Maria explained. "The homeowners own their houses, but they lease the land from Rosa's estate, which is now you. It's more common than you'd think, especially in master plan communities where developers need to maintain control over certain parcels." She showed me copies of lease agreements that I'd apparently inherited. Each ground lease provides steady income, typically $300 to $500 per month per property. The homeowners probably don't even realize they're tenants because the lease payments are often bundled into their HOA fees. So the people paying HOA fees are actually paying rent to me. Partially, yes. About $150 of each monthly HOA fee goes to the ground lease holders, which means you've been receiving about $1,800 per month in lease income since your aunt died. The property management company has been depositing it into an account that we set up during probate. I was stunned. I'd been so focused on the house and dealing with Karen's harassment that I'd completely ignored the investment income that had been accumulating in my accounts. Maria, whose land is Karen Hoffman's house built on. Maria smiled and flipped through the documents. Let me see. Karen Hoffman, 1247, Desert Rose Drive. Yes, here it is. She's one of your tenants. Jessica. She's been paying you $400 per month in ground lease fees since she moved to Sunset Valley. I felt a slow smile spreading across my face. Are you telling me that Karen has been collecting fines from her own landlord? It gets better. As the ground leaseholder, you have certain rights regarding property use and community standards. If a tenant violates the terms of their lease, which includes provisions about harassment of other community members, you have grounds to terminate the lease and reclaim the property. Maria showed me the relevant section of Karen's ground lease agreement. Look at Section 12. Tenant agrees to maintain harmonious community relations and shall not engage in activities that create hostility or conflict with other residents or property owners. Karen's harassment campaign against you could be considered a violation of her lease terms. Technically, you have the right to evict her. That afternoon, I walked through Sunset Valley with completely new eyes. The community center where Karen held her tyrannical board meetings was sitting on land I owned. The retention basin that protected the entire neighborhood from flooding was my property. Even some of the streets and sidewalks crossed easements that belonged to me. More importantly, I realized that Karen had been using her position as HOA president to harass and fine someone who had the legal authority to kick her out of the community entirely. Over the next week, Maria and I developed a strategy. We decided not to reveal the full extent of my property ownership immediately. Instead, we'd start by asserting my rights as a ground leaseholder and see how Karen responded to having her authority challenged. Maria drafted a letter that was a masterpiece of legal precision. Mrs. Hoffman, we are writing regarding recent violation notices issued to Ms. Martinez. After reviewing Ms. Martinez's property rights and lease agreements, we must inform you that several of your enforcement actions may constitute harassment under the terms of your ground lease agreement with the Martinez estate. The letter went on to explain that as a ground leaseholder, I had specific rights regarding community standards and that attempts to impose unreasonable fines or forced destruction of established landscaping could result in lease termination proceedings. We sent copies to every board member, the property management company, and Karen's attorney, along with relevant excerpts from her lease agreement. Karen's response was swift and predictable. Within hours, I received a furious phone call. Martinez, I don't know what kind of legal nonsense your lawyer is peddling, but I'm not intimidated by empty threats. I've been managing properties longer than you've been alive. Karen, I'm simply trying to resolve this reasonably. The violations you've cited don't have any legal basis. I'll determine what has legal basis in this community. You seem to forget that I'm the president of this HOA. And you seem to forget that you're also a tenant who signed a lease agreement with specific terms about community relations. There was a long pause. What are you talking about? Your ground lease, Karen. The one you signed when you bought your house. The one that requires you to maintain harmonious relationships with other residents. Another pause. You're bluffing. There's no such thing as a ground lease in Sunset Valley. Check your closing documents, Karen. Look at where your monthly HOA fees actually go. You're insane if you think you can threaten me. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm just explaining the legal realities of property ownership in this community. Karen hung up, but I knew she'd be making calls to verify what I told her. A woman with her ego wouldn't admit ignorance without checking with her attorney first. The next board meeting was moved up by a week, with a special agenda item to address false claims regarding property ownership and lease agreements. Karen had decided to make this a public confrontation. I arrived at the meeting with Maria and a briefcase full of documents. The community center was packed. Word had spread that there was going to be a showdown between the new resident and the HOA president. Karen opened the meeting with a dramatic speech about frivolous legal challenges and residents who think they can intimidate community leadership with fabricated documents. Ms. Martinez has attempted to undermine this board's authority with claims about non-existent lease agreements, Karen declared. Tonight, we're going to expose these lies and demonstrate that no one is above community standards. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up calmly and walked to the front of the room. Thank you, Mrs. Hoffman. I'd like to clarify some misconceptions about property ownership in Sunset Valley. I set up a projector and displayed a map of the community with 17 parcels highlighted in different colors. These highlighted areas represent land owned by the Martinez family estate. As you can see, they include the community center where we're meeting, several neighborhood parks, the retention basin, and the ground underneath 12 individual homes. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as people realized what they were looking at. When Sunset Valley was developed in the 1990s, my great-aunt Rosa Martinez purchased these parcels as long-term investments. The homes built on these lots operate under ground lease agreements, which means the homeowners own their houses but lease the land from the Martinez estate. I could see Karen's face turning red as she began to understand the implications. Mrs. Hoffman, the house you live in sits on land owned by my family. The community center where you hold these meetings is on my property. The violation notices you've been sending me are being issued by someone who is technically my tenant. The room erupted in shocked conversation. People were pulling out their phones to call their real estate agents and checking their own closing documents. Karen stood up, her face purple with rage. This is preposterous. You can't just claim to own other people's property. I'm not claiming anything, Mrs. Hoffman. I'm simply explaining ownership records that have been filed with the county for nearly 30 years. Maria stood up and began distributing copies of ground lease agreements to board members. Every homeowner affected by these lease agreements can verify the information by reviewing their closing documents. The ground lease terms are clearly stated in their property deeds. The meeting devolved into chaos as neighbors began frantically calling attorneys and title companies to confirm what they'd just heard. Board members were studying the lease agreements, trying to understand how they'd been unaware of these arrangements. Karen tried to restore order, shouting over the crowd that this was all legal trickery and fraudulent documentation. Finally, Bob Chen, a retired accountant who'd lived in the community since 1998, stood up and called for quiet. Jessica, if what you're saying is true, what does this mean for our property values and our rights as homeowners? It was exactly the question I'd hoped someone would ask. Bob, these ground leases don't affect your ownership rights or property values at all. You own your homes free and clear. The lease agreements simply formalize the land ownership structure that's been in place since the community was built. I looked directly at Karen. However, the lease agreements do include provisions about community relations and tenant behavior. Harassment of other residents or property owners can be grounds for lease termination. Martha Williams, an elderly woman who'd been one of Karen's biggest supporters, raised her hand. What about our HOA fees? If you own the land, why are we paying the association? The HOA fees cover community maintenance, landscaping, and administrative costs, I explained. But a portion of each payment, typically $150 per month, goes to the ground leaseholders as required by your purchase agreements. Maria added, the Martinez estate has been using this income to fund community improvements, maintain common areas, and support local environmental projects. It's been operating exactly as designed. Karen made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Even if these leases exist, they don't give Martinez the right to violate community standards. Actually, Karen, Maria replied, they do give Jessica certain rights regarding reasonable use of her property. More importantly, your harassment campaign against Jessica violates the community relations clause in your own lease agreement. She pulled out Karen's lease document. Section 12 clearly states that tenants must maintain harmonious relationships with other residents and property owners. Your violation notices and attempts to force destruction of established landscaping constitute harassment under the lease terms. The implication was clear. Karen could be evicted from the community for harassing her own landlord. The meeting ended with the board voting to suspend all pending violation notices pending a complete legal review. Karen left without speaking to anyone, her authority completely undermined. Over the next few days, the community buzzed with excitement and concern as people processed the revelation. Property values remained stable, the ground leases were transferable and didn't affect homeowner equity. If anything, the community's unique structure and professional management made it more attractive to potential buyers. The real question was what would happen with Karen's leadership. She tried to maintain her position, but her credibility was destroyed. She'd spent months harassing the one person in the community who could legally evict her. The resolution came sooner than expected. 1 week after the community meeting, I received a certified letter from Karen's attorney, informing me that Karen Hoffman was resigning from the HOA board and putting her house on the market. The letter included a formal apology for the misunderstanding regarding my property rights and a request that the Martinez estate not pursue lease termination proceedings. I was happy to agree. I'd never wanted to ruin anyone's life. I just wanted to live peacefully in my inherited home without harassment. The community held special elections, and Bob Chen was voted in as the new president. The new board established a cooperative relationship with the Martinez estate, creating clear guidelines for property improvements and community standards. Today, Sunset Valley is thriving under this partnership between traditional HOA governance and ground lease management. Property values have increased as the community has gained recognition for its stable management and unique ownership structure. My own property has become a showcase for sustainable desert landscaping, with Aunt Rosa's garden now serving as a demonstration site for water-wise gardening techniques. The landscape architecture projects I work on often use my own yard as an example of successful desert conservation. Karen Hoffman learned the hard way that power trips and harassment campaigns can backfire spectacularly when you target the wrong person. She thought she was dealing with just another homeowner who could be bullied into compliance. Instead, she'd been harassing her own landlord, someone with the legal authority to evict her entirely. The experience taught me valuable lessons about understanding your legal rights and the importance of thorough estate planning. Aunt Rosa had created a brilliant investment strategy that provided both steady income and community influence, but she'd never explained the full scope of what she was leaving me. More importantly, I learned that with property ownership comes responsibility. Owning land underneath other people's homes isn't just about collecting rent, it's about being a good steward and maintaining positive community relationships. Today, when new residents move to Sunset Valley, they're fully informed about the ground lease structure from the beginning. There are no surprises, no hidden ownership arrangements, and no more power-hungry board members making decisions without understanding the legal framework they're operating within. The ground lease income continues to fund community improvements and environmental projects throughout the area, exactly as Aunt Rosa intended when she made her strategic investments 30 years ago. And Karen Hoffman. She moved to a cookie-cutter subdivision in Scottsdale where she can't harass her neighbors because she has no authority over anyone. Hopefully, she learned that assuming you have power over someone can be a very expensive mistake when you don't understand who actually owns what. Sometimes the best way to deal with bullies isn't to fight back directly. It's to simply reveal who really has the power in the relationship. Karen spent months trying to enforce rules on someone who could have kicked her out of the neighborhood with 30 days' notice. The irony was delicious, and the justice was perfect.